Hello, and welcome to an introduction to AI and Azure AI services. My name is Bobby Russell, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. And over the next series of videos, we'll be covering an intro in AI, but we'll also cover some of the various AI technologies that are available within Microsoft. The goal of this video is to help you prepare for the AI 102 exam. Now, keep in mind that we will not cover every concept that will be covered on the exam, but we will cover a great deal of information here. It does require that you go to the Microsoft Learn site and read through a lot of the documentation related to AI 102 and the course itself to get more in-depth knowledge. And it's also recommended that you practice a little bit, build your own lab, and practice deploying some of these technologies to help you further understand how it works. But again, welcome to this course. The goal of this course is we're gonna create very small video snippets here. The videos are going to be anywhere from 15 minutes to about 30 minutes long. And the reason for that is we want you to be able to consume the data in chunks versus just a constant stream of information here. That way you can also take one section, take a break, maybe the next day or whenever, come back and do the next section and have a systematic way of doing things. But we welcome you and hope you enjoy this course. In our first section, we'll talk about the intro in Azure AI and generally AI services and what they are. So that's going to be the first topic that we're going to cover. And after completing this, you'll have a better understanding of what artificial intelligence is and how it compares to machine learning and data science. And also, we're going to be able to describe some of the Azure AI services that are available out there. So, first thing we get into is what is artificial intelligence? Well, AI has been around for a very, very long time. The concept of it and even the underlying technologies that we use today were developed years ago in preparation for this. But what truly defines artificial intelligence is something that can exhibit some type of human-like capabilities. And examples, as you see here, are things like visual perception, being able to look and based off of a visual perception, be able to understand what it is, like looking at an image and being able to determine, okay, in this image, there's a cat or a dog, there's some buildings, there's some vehicles in the road and so forth. So that's a human-like characteristics. Being able to distinguish those components and understand it. But not just when it comes to fixed images, but also when it comes to videos, being able to watch videos and understand what's going on in those videos. So visual perception is a very important component. The second thing we look at is, being able to analyze text, documentation, being able to take documents, analyze them, and understand exactly what those documents are doing. The third thing we have is just natural conversation, having the ability to have a conversation, a chat, if you will, between two entities. That is a great identifier for human-like capabilities. And then finally, decision-making capabilities. Being able to ingest data, to consume data, and then based off of that information, make a decision. So these are some of the human-like capabilities that we look for in an AI or an artificial intelligence technology. So those are four of the key tenets that we look for here. Now, as software engineers, if you're going down the path of software engineering, when it comes to AI, the good news is that we've got a lot of tools already built to help you in your endeavor. There are many different SDKs that we have available, whether it's Python, .NET, Java, and so forth, that you can use. Now, keep in mind, in order to truly develop or use AI from a software standpoint, you do need to have some coding capabilities. And any one of the major languages, Python, Java, and so forth, as you can see here. But you need to have an understanding of coding. The second thing you need to understand is, what is an SDK? What is a REST API? Those are going to be important components. And in addition, have an understanding of CI/CD, pipeline management, source control, and these are all things that fall under the DevOps category. So it's important that you have not a master's level understanding of it, but definitely an understanding of how those components work. Other things that you need to understand when it comes to AI. We talk about conceptual AI understanding. And in there, we look at things like model training, and we'll talk about what models are and even talk about how to train those models here in our following videos. But what is a model? How do you train a model? What models are already available for you to use? And inferencing, which basically gets into being able to deduce something based off of the information that you have. Other things we're going to look at, probability and confidence scores. Keep in mind, no matter what we say, AI is still software and hardware technologies that are mimicking human-like capabilities. And at this point in the stage of AI, it is not 100% accurate. It is not always going to give you the best possible decision or best possible information. So one of the things you'll need to understand as a software engineer is if we submit a request into one of our AI models and it provides a response. When it provides that response, it's not only going to give us the response, but it's also going to give us what's called a probability or confidence score. And what it's going to tell us is, okay, from a scale of, let's say, 1 to 100%, how confident is the AI system in its response? If I were to ask the AI model, hey, I've got an image, and in the image there are 15 dogs, and I ask the AI model, hey, how many cats are in this image? The AI model will look at the image, analyze it using various technologies, and determine, okay, there's a low probability based on the image of cats. It may say there's 2 cats in the image when they're not, and it may come back and say there's 2 cats, but there's only a 10% chance that we're accurate. Whereas if I would ask the model, hey, in this image of dogs, of pictures of dogs, how many dogs are in here? It can then look at that image, analyze it, add up the total images of dogs within the picture, and then come back and say there are, let's say, a dozen dogs in there, and I have a 99% probability or confidence score that I'm accurate. So as developers, you'll need to be able to take that information, determine, okay, what is the threshold that we're going to use for determining if the response is something that we can use or not, based off of the level of confidence. And we'll dive more into that in this video series. And then the final thing we look at is responsible AI and ethics. This is very important. One of the key tenets in any AI vendor that you use is the fact that we want to use AI for the betterment of humanity. We want to use AI for the betterment of our business as far as applications and technologies that we're providing. What we don't want to use it for is to do harm. What we don't want to use it for is to be biased. What we don't want it to be used for is, again, to provide misinformation whenever possible. So using AI in a responsible manner is very important as part of this. And every vendor has some sort of AI, responsible AI metric or ethics within their technologies. Now, within responsible AI, it typically falls under 6 different categories. Those categories are fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. So these are the 6 key tenets that we have. And if you follow the link here at the bottom, Microsoft.com/AI/responsible AI, it'll dive more in depth, in detail into each one of those. But to give you an example here, when we look at privacy and security, one of the key components here is ensuring that the user knows what information is being shared, what information is being used, and how it's being used. So this is a very important one. Reliability and safety is another key one. For this one, we look at things like how do we ensure that the technology that we're developing isn't going to be used for harm or for malicious intent, if you will. So these are key things. Fairness, let everyone use it. It should be open for everyone to use it, which is very important, along with inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. So take a look at that link there to get more detailed information on each one of the 6 tenets that we have here pertaining to responsible AI. If you've taken the AZ 900 course, then these are important because these are things that you'll see in your exam. In the AI 102, it's assumed that you know all of this already, but it's important as developers that when you're developing using AI technology, that you keep these things in mind as part of your process. Now, we mentioned earlier that the concept of AI has been around for a very long time. Very, very long time. We're talking, 20, 30 years easily. Now, back then we didn't have the technology to develop a true AI model like we have now. Back then we didn't have the compute power that was required to be able to analyze and process the large amount of data that's required in order to develop AI. But over time, we've progressed, and we started with other things like machine learning. As you can see here, machine learning or cloud computing for creating and operating machine learning solutions. What machine learning essentially is, in its most fundamental form, is the ability to take existing data, run it through a model of some sort. That model will analyze that existing data, and then based off of that existing data and the model, we can then generate things like predictions based on what has happened in the past, what's going to happen in the future. A perfect example of that would be, let's say, the real estate market. If you're buying a home, buying or selling a home. If you're a realtor, you could use machine learning to feed in, all the homes that were sold in a specific area over, let's say, a 1-year period or over a 10-year period, for month by month, week by week, day by day. You can take all of that data, run it through a model, and that model can then predict, okay, based on historical information, the bulk of homes being sold are anywhere from June to September. And then based off of that additional data, historical data, we can also tell you that the majority of homes are sold on Saturdays and Sundays, or that's when most of the inquiries are made for, either buying a home or selling a home. So that's an example of using machine learning to take previous data to predict or analyze it to determine things like trends, patterns, or even things, in a sense, predicting the future. Based on the past, here's what we can expect in the future. This has been used for a very long time with, various companies. Automobile manufacturers will use this to determine things like, the wear and tear of parts. Warranty information. How long is a part typically good for before it falls apart? And we're going to generate a warranty because we have a reasonable expectation this widget in this vehicle is going to last about 8 years. So we're going to make the warranty 8 years. We're going to guarantee it for that. So you can use machine learning for that. In retail, it's used a lot to determine trends, to determine, if you have a large amount of stores, let's say a Walmart or something like that, which stores are producing the best, which ones aren't, what's the hottest selling product, what's not, based on different times of years, which products are going to be the ones that we want to make sure we have plenty of inventory on because we're going to sell a lot more of those versus other things and so forth. So you can use machine learning technology in a varying amount of ways to do that. But that is one of the underlying technologies that we use in artificial intelligence. We take existing information, we analyze it to make determinations. So this is a very important component. Now, within Azure, there are many AI services. In the past, we used to call them cognitive services. So if you look at older documentation or older websites out there, you may see the term cognitive services, but now we refer to them as AI services. And those AI services are fall into primarily 4 different categories here. And in this course, in our following videos, we're going to dive into these a lot more. We're going to do some demonstrations and so forth, but they're going to fall under the language category. And for language, we're going to analyze text, data. We're going to have a question and answer or Q&A service where we can ask a question to the system, and the system, based on data, can provide an answer for us. It can do language understanding. Language understanding basically is, okay, what is I forgot the term here. Somebody makes a statement. Sentiment analysis. That's what I'm looking for. Sentiment analysis. Is the statement that someone made positive, negative, or neutral? So that's a perfect example of that when it comes to language understanding. How is this useful? Well, let's say you're a manufacturer of a product, and let's say you have a Twitter account as a manufacturer, and your customers will post information or on your Twitter accounts or your Facebook, your social media accounts. And as a manufacturer, you want to find out, you know, generally speaking, what type of posts are being made to our social media accounts? Are they primarily positive in favor of what we're doing? Are they primarily negative, or are they somewhere in between, neutral? So language understanding can give you that type of capability. And of course, translation, translating one type of language to another. So English to Spanish or Spanish to French and so forth. So you get those capabilities, as well as identifying what type of language is being used. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with the language component. The second component that we have here that we'll talk about is speech. And for speech, we look at things like speech recognition. We look at speech synthesis, speech translation, and speaker recognition. So these are all capabilities that we provide within our AI services. Under vision, we can do image and video analysis. We can do image classification. A nice one is object detection, which we'll demonstrate a lot of these, and OCR, optical character recognition, which has been around for a very long time. But the technology has evolved because now we can do OCR within videos, whereas before it had to been more in a fixed file like an image. Now we can do it through video streaming and things like that. So it's evolved over time here. And then finally, typically when you hear about AI nowadays, everybody thinks about the fourth type, which is generative AI. This is where your chat GPT or your OpenAI technologies really come into play. Now, and with this, now we can generate text completions, which is basically saying, hey, I want to start a sentence or start a conversation, and I want you to take, based on what I've already started with, and finish it. Make up something, like say a story. And we're going to have fun with that in our video series here. We're going to demonstrate a lot of that. And also image generation. So we start using technologies like DALL-E to do that, where you can say, you can tell the AI model, hey, create a picture of a unicorn sitting on a beach with a volcano in the background erupting while it's sipping a margarita. And with image generation, it will create that image. Now, one thing I do want to point out here, the primary difference between the first three capabilities, which we'll talk about, and the fourth capability is the first three primarily will provide responses to existing information, similar to what we do with things like machine learning technologies. Generative AI is a little bit different because it can create something from scratch. That is the biggest difference between generative AI and the other three technologies. But we can use them all intertwined with each other to accomplish whatever goal we need. So, and we'll get into all of those as we go throughout our course here. All right. So another technology we have is AI search. This is going to be very useful when you have a large repository of data and you want to be able to search against that data. So you can use the AI search service to go in and essentially index all of the information to make it easier for searching. And as I mentioned with the other technologies, search works hand in hand with some of the other AI technologies that we have. And we'll demonstrate that in our videos here also. So let's go ahead and get started here. Hopefully you're enjoying this. Again, the first video is kind of an introduction into the technologies. We're going to dive deeper into the technologies into the subsequent videos that we have. All right, so in our second section, we're going to look at, understanding an Azure AI API. And we're going to talk about how do we create and consume AI services and the resources specifically. Now, I'll do a video demonstration following the discussion here and walk you through exactly how to do this. But as far as for this video here, one of the first things that you'll need to do before you can use the AI service is you need to provision the AI service. And to give you an example here, I've got an image here of or I should say a picture here. And in this picture, I've got my Azure environment. So this right here is my Azure environment. Within my Azure environment, I've got my subscription. I've got the Azure AI service where I can deploy any of the various AI services that I want. And as an example here, I've just got a web application that's going to use or use that service. Now, one of the first things that you'll need to do before you get started is you need to create an AI service, or I should say an instance of that service. And to do that, you're going to go into your Azure AI portal, or the Azure portal, or you can do it through PowerShell or Bash if you want to. But most of our demonstrations are going to be using the GUI, which makes through the browser, which makes it a lot simpler. But you're going to go into the Azure portal in the search bar at the top, and you're going to type in Azure AI Services. Once you've gotten there, you're going to select the option to create a new Azure AI service. Now, there are two different types of services that you can create within here. The first one is actually a single service resource. An example of that would be, I just want to use Azure OpenAI. I want to use the generative AI technology. I don't want to use speech. I don't want to use document intelligence. I don't want to use any of my vision services. I just want to use one instance. That's a single service resource. The second option I have is a multi-service resource. Now, the primary difference between a multi-service and a single service resource comes down to access and billing. With a single service resource, when I create that instance, it generates what's called an endpoint and a key. It's going to generate an endpoint and a key. So with a single service resource, I get one endpoint and one key, and forgive me for my terrible drawing here, one endpoint and one key that something can use. So that one resource can use that one endpoint and key. In this case here, let's say it's OpenAI. We're using it for the Azure OpenAI service, which means this is going to be tied. Oh, there's a one-to-one relationship between endpoint and key and the service. Now, with a multi-service resource, what ends up happening is I have an endpoint, just like we had before, and a key, and we'll talk about more about endpoints and keys a little bit later, but I can have multiple services using that. So in this example, I can have OpenAI, I can have document intelligence, I can have maybe vision service, I can have all of these different services all using the same endpoint and same key, which also gives me the ability to consolidate billing. So all of these resources would show up under one bill. Now, why is this important? So let's talk about why this is important, multi versus single. If your organization or if you want to be able to break out billing in a very simple way, because there's many different ways you can do it, but if you want to break out billing in a very simple way, and let me give you an example here. I want OpenAI instance one. I've got one instance of OpenAI that's used by a web app that we use within our organization. And I always want to keep track of how much that instance is costing us. The easiest way to do that is to create a single service resource, which allows us to go in and say, okay, that resource is tied to that one instance. Now, if I have a scenario where I don't really need granular billing, I don't need to break it out on a per instance basis. I just want, everything, I'm an organization where we don't break things out for different departments and so forth. I just want it all under one bill, under one subscription. Then I can use the multi-service resource. And what that gives me is the ability to have one or more OpenAI instances. It allows me to have vision. It allows me to have document intelligence. It allows me to have my speech services all under one instance. And what that gives me is the ability to consolidate all my billing for all of those services instead of having to break it out individually. So to kind of summarize this, to make it simple, if you need to break it out for billing purposes on a per instance basis, use a single service. If you do not have a requirement to break it out into more granular billing where it can all be put under one bill, then use a multi-service resource. So that's the main difference between the two technologies. So when you create your Azure service, you're going to specify, is it a multi-service or are you going to pick an individual? There is no single service option. You just pick OpenAI. But for multi-service, it's actually called multi-service. But regardless of which one you select, it's going to ask you for a subscription. Everything ties back to some type of billing account. So you need a subscription. It's going to tie back to a resource group. And it ties back to a resource group for security, for management purposes, for role-based access control, and even for some billing purposes in a sense, which is beyond the scope of this course. And then we have to define which Azure region we're going to deploy this instance of AI. We're going to give it a name. The name must be globally unique. It's got to be a unique name. And then the pricing tier that we're going to use. Now, keep in mind, the pricing tier options in your dropdown will vary depending on the service you select. If you do a multi-service, then it's pretty standard. But if you do a single service, so if I pick, let's say, OpenAI versus Document Intelligence versus Vision, the drop-down for the pricing tier, there may be different pricing tiers for each of those services. So keep that in mind. And then finally, if you need to, well, I shouldn't say finally, but there are some additional options. So this is our basics page that you see here. Under the next page, which I'll talk about in our demonstration, the network section, I can define, who can consume these AI services. Is it someone only inside of my organization, inside my network? Is it someone, public across the internet? It's up to you. And then some additional things that I can look at as part of this is identity. Now, what account? Are we going to use a managed identity as part of this? Then we can add metadata tags, and then finally, review and create, which you see down here, where we deploy the instance. Now, once we do that, let's go back to our picture here. Here's what's actually happening in this scenario. So once I've deployed that, within my AI service, there'll be an instance created, either a single instance or a multi-service instance. And then within that instance, there'll be a unique API key and endpoint. So there's an OpenAI, or if we use OpenAI as an example, an OpenAI key and an OpenAI endpoint. These are very important. I like to simplify this as, think of an endpoint key as a username and password. It's not technically that. The endpoint is basically the path that you take to submit your request, to make the call. And then the API key is the way of authenticating or validating that you have the right to make that request. It's like an authentication process. So it generates an API key. I call it an AI key here for an AI instance, but it's an API key and an API endpoint. That API key and endpoint that was generated here is what you would use in your application code to create a client and generate a request that's sent to the AI instance. So what will, for the most part, always happen is your application, or whatever you're developing, we'll use a web app in our example here. Our web application, let's say it's a chat bot. I'm a mortgage company and I have a publicly facing web page, and on that web page, I want to have a chat window where users can ask, or customers can ask questions, or potential customers can ask questions. So I can go in and write that application, and then in that app, put the API key and endpoint. And now when a customer or a potential customer has a question, they can go to my webpage, type the question, what's the current mortgage rates for my company, ask a question. That request will then be formatted and sent to the AI instance. And back here, we have the Azure AI service, so our AI itself. It's then sent within Microsoft into AI to be I like to call it AI, but basically to be processed based on whatever models we're using and so forth. And then the response is provided back to the application, which in turn is the response is provided back to the customer in the chat window. So that is how that process works. Now, that entire process of submitting that request to the instance and then getting a response back consumes resources. It consumes CPU, it consumes some RAM, and so forth. So what we need to do is we need to determine, how do we bill you for that? So when that request comes in and the response is provided back to the web application, that data, not that I shouldn't say data, the cost for processing that request is sent to the subscription, which is part of your billing. And then at the end of the month, it generates your total cost along with everything else, and it generates a bill for you. But that is the kind of the very high level workflow of what happens with the AI service. Now, let's assume this is a single instance. It's going to have its own API key and endpoint. It's going to send it here. And by the way, with a single instance, it's going to be for one. Think of single as one. If I were to create a multi-service, in that multi-service, I can have OpenAI running in here. I can have document intelligence running in here. I can have, let's say, a vision service running in here, a speech service running in here, and I can then have a request sent here directly, and then the processing occur that way. So again, it allows you to be able to break out the billing process within there. And in our next demonstration, once we're done with here, we're going to do a video demonstration of how this works. You'll see, and we'll discuss that a little bit more as we go forward. Now, once you've generated the service, I've been talking about endpoints and keys. Your service creates an endpoint. This is where you make your call to. And we always generate two keys. We always create two keys for you. And you can use either key if you want to. But the reason we give you two keys is for security purposes. So you can alternate keys for security. You don't want to just use one key indefinitely. Just like in the real world, you would never use one password, for the rest of your life. No, you're required, or you should periodically cycle through and change your password. So we give you the ability to do that very seamlessly by giving you two keys. And the last component we give you is the location. Now, for most AI technologies, the location doesn't matter as much, but there are a few, which we'll talk about in our later course videos here, where the location does matter. But for most of them, the location doesn't necessarily matter for setting it up. But the important, I want to say the key point, but the important point we have here is that you're going to generate keys and an endpoint as part of your service. That is how you submit the request to the AI service from your application. You've got to have those two components within there. All right, so once you've got your service created, and this kind of shows you the picture that I showed, you have your application. Your application is going to submit a properly formed request. It's going to be using REST API is the underlying technology that we're using. It's going to generate a request to the AI service. It's going to require that key and endpoint. So you're going to have the key and endpoint as part of this. It's going to be sent. As long as you have the proper key and endpoint, the service will then process your request and then generate a response for you in JSON format. So this is essentially how that process works at a very high level. Now, one of the things we do provide for you, of course, are a bunch of runtime libraries that abstract the REST API. So depending on what language you're more comfortable with, there's quite a few of them here. .NET, C++, Python, Node, Java. There's a few of them that we have here that pretty much cover the majority of the languages that are popular out there too that you can use. So you can pick and choose which ones you want to use as for your development component here. All right, so how do we use AI services for our enterprise applications? So let's get into a little bit about this. So we're going to talk about, we're going to consider and manage authentication and network security for AI services. We're going to look at cost and metrics and alerts and diagnostics. We're going to talk about those really. And then deploy secure containers, which is another type of AI service that we provide. So we'll dive into that. And that will complete this first kind of intro video that we have. Keep in mind, the first video is very high level. We'll do more of a deeper dive as we get into our additional modules. All right, so from an AI security perspective, because everything needs security, one of the important things, remember, when you create an instance, it generates an endpoint and two keys, a pair of keys. You can use either key that you want, But we do recommend that you cycle through the keys, periodically. Now, because we do give you two keys and they both work, it allows you to avoid service interruption. Because if I'm using key one right now and I need to change that key, there's many different ways of doing this. And in other courses, we cover that. But what I can do is just update my application code to use key number two. And key number two works just like key number one. Once I've updated my application code to use key number two, I can now regenerate key one or reset key number one, and it generates a brand new key for me. So now I'm using key number two, and I've got a brand new key one. After a few weeks and months or whenever your change process timeline occurs, I then say, okay, let's change our code to use key one again, and we're going to reset key two. So the primary benefit of two keys is the ability to reduce or avoid completely service interruption. Now, we always recommend as a best practice that you store your keys not in your application code, but they should be stored in an Azure Key Vault. Now, if you're not familiar with what an Azure Key Vault is, go to the Microsoft Learn site, go to Microsoft's Copilot and ask it, what is a Key Vault? Give me more details, and it will definitely give you more information. But from a DevOps standpoint, you should always put your keys, your endpoints, in a Key Vault. You should not put them directly in your code for security purposes. But these are best practices that we do recommend. All right, so it's nice that we have all of these AI technologies that you can use, but one of the other benefits that you give you is not just the ability to deploy AI, but also to keep track of what's going on, to monitor it, if you will. So as part of that, we give you the ability to generate alerts. We give you alert capabilities. And there's a plethora, I'm going to use a big word here, a plethora of different alerts that you can generate specifically dealing with AI. You can also look at things like performance data. So we look at metrics. How well is it performing? How many requests are we receiving? How many are being processed? So there's, again, similar with alerts, with metrics, there's a lot of different metrics that we can monitor. Oh, and by the way, I can monitor it using a metric, and if it exceeds or goes below a certain threshold that I want, I can then have it generate an alert for me. And we'll dive more into that in our future video sessions here. We can do troubleshooting with diagnostics. So I can send, look at diagnostics data pertaining to my service. And then finally, log data. There's a lot of log data that's generated, and I can keep that log data directly in the AI service, or a lot of times we'll want to take that and put it into, let's say, a log analytics workspace, which is part of diagnostic settings also, so that we can run queries later on for troubleshooting, analysis, and so forth. So there are a lot of different ways that we can do that as part of that. But we give you a lot of different tools and capabilities to do that. If you're not familiar with alerts, metrics, diagnostic settings, or logs, go to the Microsoft Learn site or use Microsoft Copilot, and it will give you a lot of detailed information. We also cover this in a lot of our other courses, like our AZ 104. If you've never taken the AZ 104 class, take a look at that. We get into alerts, metrics, diagnostics, and logs a lot more in depth in those courses. But that same technology works within AI. And then to wrap things up, one of the challenges that we have, or I should say, one of the considerations we need to keep in mind is this. If I'm a customer, here I am, I'm sitting over here, I'm the customer. One of my concerns may be is I don't want data to be sent to Microsoft. For whatever reason, I don't want my data that when I'm doing an AI request to be sent to Microsoft. So the question then becomes, well, how do we make it work if we're not sending that request to Microsoft? Well, Microsoft provides the ability for an organization. So let's draw a box here for the organization. So let's go in here. Oops, that is not a box, that is a line. And there we go. And we're going to put this to the back here. So let's say this is the customer org. And as a customer, I don't want my data to be sent to Microsoft for security, compliance purposes. For whatever reason, I don't want my data being sent to Microsoft. So how can I use a lot of the AI technologies without sending that data to Microsoft? Well, one of the capabilities that we give you as a customer is instead of sending your request directly to Microsoft, you can create a container instance. So you can create a container within your container infrastructure on-prem in your environment. And now what will happen is, and forgive me for my terrible drawing here, what will happen is instead of your application sending the information to Microsoft, what will happen is, let's get rid of this line here. What will happen is your organization will send the request to your AI instance container that you have sitting here. Your container will process it and provide the response. So now all the data is staying within your organization and it's not being sent. And by the way, when we say data, it's a request. Whatever's in that request is not being sent to Microsoft, it's being sent to a container within your organization. And then what happens is the container will then report, I should be a little bit more specific, to the instance, just the billing information. So that way we can track cost related to it. So we don't send data, we only send consumption information, billing information. So that's the benefit. Now, if you decide you want to use the container version of AI, you do have the ability to do that. Keep in mind, though, unless you get special authorization, the container must always have internet connectivity. Or I should be more specific, the container must have a connection back to Azure, a continuous connection. If you try to deploy the container without an internet connection or without connections back to Azure, it won't work. It won't work unless you get special approval from Microsoft. So there's an option to get approval from Microsoft to use a container without any internet connectivity. So it's essentially staying internal the entire time and goes from there. But in order to do that, you have to submit a request, you have to get approval, and we're going to bill you based on estimated usage. So you're going to tell us, on a given month how much you're going to use it, and then based off of that, we're going to bill you monthly based off of that. But that does require special approval to do that. So, but you can deploy a container using, let's say, Kubernetes if you want to use it internal within your organization. And we do deploy. I should say we do provide container instances that you can use for that are already pre-built with all of that technology in there. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But so you do have the ability to use containers. You can deploy them to local Docker hosts. You can deploy them to an Azure container instance, or Kubernetes, or in Docker again, you can have your own internal Kubernetes cluster that you're using to keep it in house versus sending the requests back to Microsoft. So that is another option that you have. And with that, everyone, thank you for listening to the first video. Again, the first video is very high level. It's kind of an introduction into the AI services, what AI is. In our following videos, we'll have a lot more depth, in detail about that. In addition, we're going to be, after this video is complete, we're going to do a demonstration on how to create an AI service, so you'll have an opportunity to see that. So thank you very much, and hopefully you enjoyed this video. Thank you. All right. Now that we've completed the presentation, let's go ahead and go through a demo, an example of how this would work. So what we're going to do in our demonstration, we're going to do 3 different things here. So number 1, we're going to go in and create an AI instance within our Azure subscription. So we'll demonstrate that. Once we've completed that, then we're going to use the REST interface. So you'll get an opportunity to see how REST works. And then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to use an SDK so you can get an idea of how that works also. So we'll demonstrate those 3 things. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our Azure portal. And within our Azure portal, we need to create an AI resource. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in here. We're just going to do an AI. We're going to do an AI search here. And so it'll take us to the page that has all of our various AI services. I just typed in AI search just to bring up this page here. So here are all the different AI services that are supported. If you remember, during our presentation, we talked about a single instance versus a multi-instance deployment or multi-service, single service. Here's your multi-service one, which we're not going to do right now. We're going to do a single service one, but the process for creating it is pretty much the same. So let's go ahead and go in here, and we're going to select this here. And you know what? Let's go ahead and do a multi-service. We're going to do a multi-service one. We're going to go in here and select the option to create. We're going to specify the resource group that we'd like to put it in. The region has an impact on services. Most Azure instance, or most Azure services, I should say, the region really has impact on billing and just connectivity. You know, you don't want the service to be too far from the consumer. So those are the main reasons that you would pick a region. When it comes to the AI services, the regions actually take a bigger impact because of the fact that not all regions support the same type of AI capabilities. So the region has a little bit more of an impact when it comes to AI services. So we're going to pick the East US here, and we're going to create an instance here. We'll call it Bobbie AI instance, and let's see if it's available. Yep, it's good to go. We got a green check mark. We're going to pick the pricing tier, so we're going to go with the standard tier, and we're going to basically say that we are going to follow the responsible AI requirements that we discussed in the presentation earlier. So you must select that box in order to go further. Now, for my instance, I do have the ability to define who can access that instance, or I should say, where the instance can be accessed from. We're going to keep it with the default, which is it can be accessed from inside of Azure or even outside of Azure, like from the internet. If this is a service that people from the outside world are going to need access to, then you'll definitely use this. But a lot of your AI services that you're going to deploy are going to be internal facing. So for those instances, you can either do a little bit more isolated or a fully isolated way of doing it. But we're going to keep the wide open access at this point. We're not going to do any managed identities. We're not going to add any metadata tags. Now, keep in mind, if you were doing this in a production environment, you would add tags in here. It helps with billing and reporting capabilities. So we're going to go in here, and we're going to go ahead and create it. So as you can see here, it's in the process of deploying our service, and it's done. So it's a very quick process here. All right, so now we're going to go to the instance, the resource that we just created. So if you notice here's the name of my instance, and is a multi-service account. And there's one main thing, or I guess two key things that we want to pull from this, and that's going to be our key and our endpoint. We're going to need these later on in our application code, so that way we can consume the service. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to dump these into a notepad document here. And by the way, it doesn't matter which key you use, as we mentioned earlier, as long as you use one of the two keys, you're more than fine. So we're going to need those two keys. So that is essentially the process for creating an AI service. So if I go back in here now under my multi-service account, you'll see that I've got one instance here called Bobbie AI instance. Now, this is going to be important because all billing, so anyone that consumes or uses this instance, they're going to essentially, it's going to be billed to this Azure subscription that you have right here. So that's one of the other major reasons why you may want to have multiple instances, is because you may have multiple subscriptions and you want different the costs billed to different subscriptions if you want to. But for now, we're just going to keep it here. All right, so at this point, now let's go back to our code, and this is where the magic happens. Or now in this example here, we've already got all the code pre-built for the demonstration here. But one of the first things that we need to do is we need to configure Again, if you're using C# or if you're using Python, it's up to you which one. We're going to use Python for an example here. So we're going to go in and we've downloaded the files, and we got this from GitHub. So if you do a quick search on the internet for GitHub AI 102 lab files, you'll see the link there where you can download them. I just did a git clone and pulled them down. So within here, the first thing we need to do is we need to tell our client where to send the request. How do we do that? Well, in our .env, we're going to go in and remember that endpoint that we created earlier. We're going to take that endpoint and we're going to put that here. So now it has the path on where it's going to submit the request to. And now we need some form of authentication. So that way the service is confident that we are who we are and that we should be sending the request. So we're going to put that in there. All right, so that's the first thing that you have. So now that we've got the key components within there, which is the endpoint and the key, we can go a little bit further here. Now, just to kind of give you an example, here's our REST client, and what this is essentially doing is creating various namespaces as part of the code, and this was all imported again from GitHub. Code in the main function, it retrieves the endpoint and key from your AI service. So you can kind of see that right here. To call, essentially, what we're going to be using here is text analytics. It's going to look for text analytics here. Then the program accepts the user input. So whatever the user's input is going to be here, and it uses the Git language in order to do that, which is down here, which we'll look through that here in a second. So it calls that function there, and from that point on, it submits the request. Now, as part of that there, of course, it does require the API key. So here's, as part of the request header, we're going to include the API, or the AI key, I should say, that we created earlier. So, but this is our code that we have. So now, what we're going to do is we're going to go in here, down here at the bottom, terminal. Give it a second here. All right, so at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to run it. So we're going to do a pip install python dnv, then we're going to run it here. So we've got our client running. All right, so now we've got our application, our code running here. So at this point, if you noticed here, it's asking me to put in some text information. So I'm going to go in here and this is bonjour, which is French. And this is going to submit the request. What's going to happen here, go back up here in our code here, it's going to generate a request using this endpoint in this AI service. And it's going to basically run this Git language function here, and it's going to generate a request, and it's going to submit that request. Here's your send request option. It's going to send that request to the endpoint along with the key. The system, Azure in this case, will then receive the request, analyze it, and then provide a response. So if you notice down here, you'll see that the response was created. So here we go. So here's my my bonjour right here. Here's the information about the data. And then, of course, what I'm looking for really is down here at the bottom, which is the language that we're using, which is French. So it created a properly formatted request, submitted it. The AI service then analyzed it, responded back and said, hey, this is French. And if you remember earlier when we talked about in our presentation about confidence scores, so in this case here, it came back and said, you know what? The AI service said, I am basically 100% confident that the language that you just placed in here is French. And then, of course, it uses the international standard, or ISO, International Standard Organization, 6391 formatting for your naming there. So that's essentially how it works. So if we go in here and say gracias, I spell gracias right here. So if you notice here, it came back, and in this scenario here, it came back and said, oh, this is Spanish. It's confidence level of basically 100%, and it is ESP or ES, which is, Spanish in this case here. So we can do that. Now, what happens if I put in something that doesn't make sense? So let's go in here and say bon gracias. Hopefully that's not a real word. So if you notice here in this scenario, it came back and it said, you know what? In this case, it's Spanish, but it's only about 0.75% positive or confident that is what it is. Now, what ends up happening here is this will happen sometimes. And the reason for that, let's go ahead and clear this, is because when I put in Diagnostics, the bulk of the word in this case here is Spanish. So it's always going to give you back what the bulk of the response is going to be. If I would have had more of the word bonjour in here and less gracias, then the response would have come back and said French with a lower, a confidence score below 100%. So that's essentially how you can use REST to consume or use the AI service to do, in this case, to determine the language of the text that we're using. So in our first parts of the lab there, as you just saw, we created an Azure AI instance, in this case, a multi-service instance. Once we created the multi-service instance, we then captured the AI key as well as the endpoint. And then we demonstrated how to use that to generate a REST client request. And we did a few demonstrations with that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how do we use the SDK to do that. So in the same files that I'm using in my demo, I have an SDK client here, and we would follow essentially the same process. So step one, I would need to, of course, put in my endpoint where we're going to send the request to. And we need to put the AI key in there. Let's go ahead and put the AI key. So now that we've got the AI key in here, we've already got an SDK client built for this here. And of course, here's our main, our get language function. Basically very similar to what we had before here. So now what we're going to do at this point here is we're going to add some additional components to this here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and open up a terminal here. And we're going to install the Azure AI Text Analytics. So we're going to do a pip install. Whoops, and I just typed it in twice here. Take a look at that there. All right, so that was successfully done. So now what we're going to do, we've already gone in and we've modified the .env file here. All right, so let's go back to our client here. So here's our client. So you'll see the information in there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do, let's go ahead and save this just to save it. I always like to save my stuff. So we're going to now run this client. So we're going to go ahead and run the client here. For some reason, it keeps being in here double. And if you notice here, it's asking for the same thing that we had when we did our REST demo. So let's go ahead and do bonjour. I'm going to come back, analyze it. Ooh, this is actually a great example here. Access due to invalid subscription key or wrong API endpoint. So let's take a look here. Did I not put in my endpoint properly here? You see right here, there's an extra Y in here for some reason. I don't know why I did that, but that's actually a great chance to troubleshoot here when you get an access deny. So my subscription or my API endpoint. So if you go back to your env file, you'll see your setting that you'll see my endpoint was right, but I had an extra Y at the very beginning here. So now if I rerun this again here, hopefully I saved it. So it's generating a request. It's going to send it to Azure, and then it's going to come back. And in this case here, it came back and said it was English, even though I put in bonjour as the language here. So let's try this again here. There we go. So there you go, gracias. let's try something else. I am terrible when it comes to languages. So let's take a look at, let's try something else. We'll do, let's do Polka. Let's see what language that comes back with. Oh, it came back with English there. So that's an example of how it should work here in our demonstration here. It's coming back. Now, sometimes that will happen, by the way, in your code, which let me see if we have it in here. We don't have it in here, but there is an option in here to specify what the preferred language would be. So it's kind of a default. If you know that the majority of your language is going to be English, then there's in your code, which we'll talk about in further in additional videos here later on, how you can say, okay, it's probably going to be English, so start with that and then work from there. So, but we don't have that in here, which is interesting. But as you can see here, the goal here is to show you how to use the SDK to generate a request for it. So hopefully you enjoyed that video. All right, so at this point, we've looked at how we can deploy a REST client as well as an SDK client, and you consume or use the AI service. So you had an opportunity to see that. For our final demonstration, we're going to look at how do we deploy an AI instance through a containerized deployment. Now, there are many different types of container technologies out there. You've got Kubernetes, you've got Azure Container Apps, you've got Azure Container Instances, as well as many other ones that are out there. But for this demonstration, we'll be using Docker Desktop to do this, which is a great tool if you're developing locally and you want to do some testing and functionality testing and troubleshooting as far as is concerned. Docker Desktop is free. You can actually go on the internet, do a quick search for Docker Desktop, and you'll see plenty of links to download it. But just for the sake of demonstration, we're going to use Docker Desktop to show you how to deploy a container instance. Now, in order to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Microsoft Container Registry website, which is mcr.microsoft.com. And once at the website, which will take you to the main page here, what we're going to do is we're going to search for Vision for our demonstration. Now, keep in mind the Microsoft Container Registry site has container templates for, as you can see, 454 different types of services that are out there. But what we're going to do is we're going to do Vision here. So I'm going to pull up Vision, and we're going to use the OCR reads Vision container. Now, the nice thing about the container registry is the fact that depending on which one you want, so let's say we want the latest one or we want one of the other versions. I'm just going to go with the top one here. We give you the Docker command, the Docker pull command to do it. So what you're going to do is you're essentially going to go into PowerShell and you're going to run this command here. So we're going to go ahead and paste this in here. There we go. Okay. And we're going to run it. So what this is going to do is going to pull down the Docker container for us, and it's going to pull the container down for us. It's going to pull it into our images that we have in our Docker image repository. So this will take about a minute to finish. So we'll give it a second to finish here. All right, so through the magic of video, we fast forwarded here, but the image has been, the container image has been downloaded, as you can see here now. So with my Docker Desktop, you can see the container images listed here. Now, this tells me the name, the tag, so if it's the latest version or one of the previous versions, it's like for version control, and then the hashed version of the image ID. Now, we're going to need this image ID a little bit later on here. So now, we need to run this container. So if I try to run this container now, I'll get an error. And the error that I'll get is the fact that, remember, in our presentation, the container must have an active internet connection to an Azure subscription. So you have to have an instance of AI running within your, whether it's a Vision instance or a multi-service instance, you've got to have it running within your Azure environment for this container to work. And also, in order to launch this container, you've got to tell it what instance through the, essentially, you're going to specify the endpoint and the API key. So we would need to go into our Azure portal and create an instance, whether it be Vision, or I did a multi-service account for this example here. Here's a multi-service account, but you can also do computer vision, which is the one we're going to be using for our demonstration here. So for our computer vision, I'm going to need the API key as well as the endpoint. So I'm going to need this endpoint, and I'm going to need one of these two keys here. And the reason for that is when I launch this through command line, and I'll demonstrate that for you here. So let's go ahead and walk through this here. So first of all, the command is, I'm going to paste the command in here so you can see this, but I will need the hashed version of the ID as part of this. So I'm going to copy this hash. I'm going to put it into my command, and I'm going to paste this. I've already got it pre-typed in for brevity, for time purposes. So we're going to go in here, and we're going to copy this. We're going to paste it in. Now, if you notice here, it went ahead and ran it. It's running it. But what I want to do is I'm going to break down the actual command for you here. So we're going to go back to our instance that we have here, and you'll see a couple things. So number one, I ran the docker run command, and then the port we're going to use is port 5000. This hash that you see here, this SHA, this hash, what that actually is this hashed image here that you see. So this is how I tell Docker which image or which container to run, to deploy. So that's the hash. Now, there are three things that are required to run an AI container outside of Azure. One, you must include the fact that you accept the end user license agreement, the EULA. So you've got to put this into your command. If you don't, you'll get a EULA error if you try to launch this. You also need to specify what AI instance. So in this case here, so for mine, it's called Bobbie Computer Vision Demo, which is computer vision. This is my instance. So this is the endpoint. So this endpoint here is what I put right there. This tells my container which AI instance to use within Azure. Then the second component, or the third component we have, is the API key, which is this piece right here, which is going to be either one of those two keys. One of those two keys will be the API key. Those are the minimum three things that you need. You must have the EULA, the end user license agreement. You've got to specify the endpoint where the request is going to be sent, primarily the billing information, and then the API key for basically the authorization to be able to do that. So now that we have that done, I've then gone in and I've launched my instance of the container. And if you notice here, it's now listening. So it's on port 5000 there. So it's actually running right now. So what I should be able to do now is to go to my localhost port 5000, and there you can see that my container is now up and running. And I can go in here from a DevOps standpoint. I can do some testing and so forth as part of this here. But this shows me that my container is up and running. Now, if I go to my privacy statement or my learn more, it's going to take me to in this case, a Microsoft website. This is not container specific. This is to the Microsoft site. If I click on learn more, this is going to take me to a Microsoft site also. But this service API description, if you notice, it's within the container itself. So I'm pulling that. I can select any of the options here. So this is an example of how you can deploy a containerized version of your AI service. Now, keep in mind, we recap this. You must have the user license agreement as part of your container when you're running it. You must specify the endpoint for billing purposes, and you must specify an API key that you're going to use as part of that. Those three things are the minimum things you need to run the container. If I exclude any one of those three things and I try to launch the command to run a container, I'll receive some sort of an error, either a billing error, EULA error, or an API key error. Hopefully you enjoyed this demo on how to deploy a containerized version of an AI service within your environment. Stay tuned for more videos. We've got a lot more coming on. Thank you.